When the kidnappers asked Joseph to choose one, he gave up on his childhood sweetheart and chose me. But I didn't go with him because I knew he would regret it in the previous life. It was the same after I was rescued. Joseph's childhood friend had inappropriate photos taken by the kidnappers and committed suicide the same night she returned home. Joseph pretended not to care and married me as planned, but he made my life miserable after the wedding. 7 years later, when I finally forced him to agree to a divorce, he lost control and drove the car off a cliff on our way to finalize it. Even in his final moments, he blamed me. It was always our debt to Chloe. This life was meant to atone for her. So who are you to live in peace? So, having a second chance, I don't want to live like that again. Jessica, come with me when I realized I was reborn. The kidnappers were pressing a knife against my and Chloe Tan's necks. They gave Joseph a choice to save one of us. Joseph's gaze lingered on us both. After a fierce internal struggle, he made the same choice as in the previous life. He reached out to me, but I firmly shook my head. Joseph, you should save Chloe first. In this life, I don't want to owe anyone, nor do I want to live with the weight of another's life. Hearing this, Joseph seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Jessica, you are my fiancée. I should save you first. But since you said so, don't blame me. Then, he hurriedly left the scene with Chloe, afraid I would change my mind the next second. But unlike him, I don't regret my decisions once they're made. In the previous life, it was the same. He came with money, but the kidnappers raised their demands, saying they would only release one person. Joseph was forced to choose me in the end, but during the time we went back to gather more money, the kidnappers got other ideas, took inappropriate photos of Chloe, and were about to assault her. Luckily, we arrived with the police in time, even though they didn't go through with it. That scene had already stripped her of all dignity. Chloe returned home shattered, and later that night, when everyone was asleep, she slit her wrists. By the time she was found, it was too late. Joseph, hearing the news, didn't show any signs of concern. He calmly handled Chloe's funeral and gave a large sum of money to her family. Even when I suggested postponing our wedding, he refused outright. Jessica, marrying you was long planned. We can't let outsiders affect that. But that so-called outsider haunted him for the next 7 years. Marrying me was just to trap me, to make me atone for Chloe. But what did I do wrong? Chapter 2. After Joseph and Chloe left, I started thinking of ways to save myself. Because this time, I wasn't sure if Joseph would come back. In the previous life, when he hugged Chloe, he discreetly dropped a tracker into her pocket. So even when the kidnappers changed locations, we could find Chloe immediately. But this time, he seemed to have forgotten about it. I guess that from the beginning, the person he wanted to save was always Chloe. It was only because I was his fiancée, and he didn't want others to criticize him that he painfully chose me. After all, ours was a marriage of convenience, and our feelings weren't that deep. Chloe accompanied him through those purest years. They were childhood sweethearts, and even closer as confidants, and it made sense for Joseph to regret it in the previous life. In this life, he finally got what he wanted. I was happy for him, but I didn't forget to find an opportunity to escape. I knew that when the kidnappers moved locations, they would pass by a car repair shop. The mechanics inside were tough and ruthless. In the previous life, when the kidnappers passed by, they wanted to temporarily occupy the repair shop, but the owner was tough and refused. A fight broke out, and the kidnappers likely never imagined they would meet someone even fiercer. In the end, afraid of causing more trouble, they fled. Later, when the kidnappers were caught, the repair shop owner even testified against them. Chapter 3. Just like in the previous life, they left one person in the car to watch me while the rest went towards the repair shop. My hands were tied behind my back, and the kidnapper in the driver's seat didn't think much of me. Taking advantage of his distraction, I bit down on the car's door handle, managing to open it. Then I pushed the door open and ran forward as fast as I could. My target was the same as the kidnappers, the car repair shop. I was gambling, hoping they wouldn't just watch me die. So I charged right in, making no attempt to hide. The repair shop was already in chaos. I immediately spotted the young owner of the repair shop. His features were sharp and upright, exuding a strong sense of righteousness. Combined with his agile movements, he had an indescribable coolness, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. I crouched low and dashed toward him as fast as I could, but I used too much force and ended up knocking him to the ground. As I fell into his arms, my face turned pale with fear. "I am sorry." I stammered out an apology. "Could you please help me?" The man glanced at me, his brows furrowing. The next second, he grabbed me and rolled us both across the ground several times. Then, with a loud bang, a chair landed where we had just been lying. If he hadn't reacted in time, I might not have survived. Still shaken, I noticed the kidnappers realizing I had escaped. What started as a takeover had now turned into a hostage situation. Both sides were in a standoff. I looked up at the man beside me and whispered, "If you save me, I'll do anything you want." But he didn't respond, only looking thoughtfully at the kidnappers. Someone behind him couldn't help but remind him, "Jonathan. Sometimes it's better not to get involved." "So his name is Jonathan." As I received no reply, my heart sank. Forget it. There's no need to force someone into this. When the leader of the kidnappers called for me a third time, I took a step forward, but almost immediately a hand pressed down on my shoulder. I was forced to stop. Jonathan stepped forward and said to the kidnappers, "She's under my protection today." It seemed even fate was on my side as the sound of roaring motorcycles suddenly echoed from outside. Jonathan's face lit up with a confident smile. "My backup has arrived." Hearing this, the kidnappers glared at me in frustration, cursed under their breath, and left. Finally, I could breathe a sigh of relief. I let out a silent breath and felt a release around my wrists. Jonathan had cut the ropes that bound my hands. Chapter 4. My name is Jessica Lynn. Thank you for earlier. I reached out my hand to him, but Jonathan kept staring at my wrist where the rope had left deep. Bloody marks. A shocking sight. "Let me take care of that for you." I shook my head. "It's just a small wound. It's nothing." Who was it just now that said they'd do anything if I saved them? Without waiting for my response, he pushed me down onto a bench and fetched a first aid kit. "Brace yourself." I bit my lip as I watched him carefully tend to my wound. A warmth suddenly spread through my heart. I remembered in my previous life, just after I married Joseph, there was a time when he got drunk. As I helped him back to the room, I casually mentioned that he should drink less. He flew into a rage, violently pushing me away. I lost my balance and fell to the ground. The jade bracelet on my wrist shattered on the floor, and the shards cut into my wrist. I screamed. Clutching my bleeding wrist in pain, Joseph saw it and only stared at me coldly, saying, "Does it hurt?" "It should. Chloe's pain was 1,000 times worse than yours, but she can't cry out anymore. If it hadn't been for saving you, she wouldn't have been humiliated by the kidnappers, and she wouldn't have ended up." I sat there, disbelief written all over my face. My heart grew colder and colder with each passing moment. It took me a long time to find my voice again. "But the kidnappers took Chloe and me to threaten you. You chose to save me first. Why are you saying this now?" Joseph's drunkenness seemed to have faded a bit, but his eyes remained icy. "Jessica, I never wanted this marriage. If you hadn't told Grandma that you liked me, she wouldn't have forced me to marry you. So what you're saying is, if it weren't for me, you would have only needed to save Chloe, right?" I suddenly laughed. "Joseph, you're ridiculous. Instead of blaming the kidnappers, you blame me." I got up and treated my wound by myself in the room. After that, no matter how much it hurt, I never told Joseph again. Now the man in front of me, afraid I was in pain, was awkwardly blowing on my wound. My eyes stung with tears. I closed them and took a deep breath, pretending to ask, "What are you doing?" Jonathan looked up, his smile pure. "When I was a kid and got hurt, my mom used to do this. Does it feel better?" I nodded. "Yes, much better." Satisfied, Jonathan continued what he was doing, but the atmosphere was soon interrupted. Chapter 5. Ming, I heard someone was causing trouble at your repair shop, so I rushed over. "Whoa, where did you find such a stunning girl?" A tall man with a floral tattoo on his arm entered through the door, and when he saw me, his eyes immediately lit up. "Wow, this is rare. I think this is the first time I've seen such a beautiful girl at your place." As he spoke, a strange blush crept up his face. Seeing this, Jonathan stepped in front of me, shielding me from view. "Thanks, but the situation is already handled. As for anything else, it's none of your business. I'll treat you to a drink another day." The tattooed man paused. finally realizing what was happening. Now that you've got a girl, you don't even want to deal with your brothers? He turned his head away in a huff, clearly upset. Jonathan sighed, then pulled him aside and whispered, "Can't you take a hint? Go cool off somewhere else." "Ming, is she your girlfriend? What do you think?" "Totally. You two look perfect together." "Smart guy, I don't care. You owe me wedding sweets. You'll get your share." The two of them kept whispering to each other not far away, even though they lowered their voices. I could still hear every word, to ease the awkwardness. I pretended to be busy, looking around, up and down, just not at them. A few minutes later, Jonathan finally managed to send the tattooed guy away. Once he was gone, Jonathan asked, "Where do you live? I'll take you home." Maybe it was selfish, but suddenly I didn't want to go back so soon. After all, my parents were always busy with their own affairs, and even if I didn't go home for a month, they wouldn't notice. As for Joseph, if I'm right, he's probably been reborn too. He's likely eager to spend his life with Chloe now and the previous life, even after being married to him for 7 years. He never took me to any events, never shared a room with me. Whenever people asked about us, he would always wear a cold expression, eventually turning me into a joke in the circle. This time I'll keep my distance from him. So I pleaded with Jonathan. "Could you let me stay for a few days?" I carefully tugged at the corner of his shirt, giving it a little shake based on both lives. He seems like a good person, and he's capable of protecting me. If I cling to him, would he refuse? Jonathan suddenly leaned in closer, his gaze unusually intense. "Little girl, if you keep this up, I might take it seriously." Maybe it was because he was so close. I could even catch the fresh scent of soap on him. I instinctively swallowed, about to speak, when a familiar voice came from behind. "What are you two doing?" It was Joseph. He had brought the police with him. Chapter 6. "Are you okay?" Joseph looked at me, and the concern in his eyes didn't seem fake. I shrugged. "Do I look like there's something wrong?" Joseph remained silent. Chloe then walked in. She glanced around at the repair shop, now back to normal operations, and bluntly asked, "Jessica, how did you escape from the kidnappers?" "As far as I know, there were 6 of them, and your hands were tied. You didn't know the area." "I'm really curious. What is Chloe implying?" "Everyone knows that the Lynn family and the Shin family are planning an alliance, but they're also eyeing that piece of land in South City. And the auction is in 10 days. Highest bidder wins." But just at the most critical moment, something like this happens, and the ransom was ridiculously high. "Jessica, it's hard not to think you had something to do with it. Is she suggesting I hired the kidnappers?" I admit in both lives I've never been this speechless. I truly felt helpless and sympathetic for what happened to Chloe in the previous life. But this time I practically saved her yet. After being rescued, the first thing she does is accuse me. It's truly disheartening. I suddenly raised my hand and shouted, "Officer, someone is slandering me here." And just like that, we were all taken in while waiting for questioning. Chloe still wouldn't let up. "Jessica, why aren't you saying anything?" I snorted. "Why should I explain anything to you? You're not a cop." Chloe was momentarily speechless. Joseph, unable to stand it, immediately stepped in to defend Chloe. "Jessica, Chloe just wants to understand what happened, so she knows what to say and what not to say during the interrogation." "Oh, so you two plan on lying to the police?" Joseph was so angry he stood up, pointing at me. "Jessica, you're being ridiculous." Jonathan, coming out of the interrogation room, saw the scene and immediately stepped between us. "Put your hand down." His tone was calm, but it carried an undeniable authority hiding behind Jonathan. I couldn't see their expressions, but I could sense the tension in the air. I heard Joseph ask, "Who are you to her?" Jonathan turned slightly to look at me, a slight smile on his lips. He countered, "What do you think?" I looked up at his perfectly sculpted profile, and on a whim, I made a heart shape with my thumb and forefinger. Joseph saw this, and his face darkened several shades. Just then, the officer called him in for questioning. Chapter 7. After a round of questioning, the police had some leads. They'd identified the suspects, and now the priority was capturing the kidnappers before moving forward with the investigation. But I knew that Joseph's competitor was behind all of this. As we left the station, Jonathan looked at me and said, "It's fine." "What?" I was confused. He explained, What you asked me earlier. It's fine. I finally understood. He was talking about letting me stay with him. It's just me and my mom at home. She's away at the old house right now, and I usually stay at the repair shop. You're welcome to stay. I was about to agree when Joseph interrupted. Jessica, your parents already know about the kidnapping. They should have landed by now and are probably heading home. Are you sure you don't want to go back? I couldn't help but feel a pang of bitterness. Joseph, an outsider, knew more about my parents than I did for as long as I could remember. They'd always been busy. Too busy to remember my birthday. Too busy to attend my parent-teacher conferences. I even purposely did poorly in school or got myself hurt just to see them. Because only then would they briefly appear and give me a tiny bit of attention. Eventually, I stopped hoping. I started celebrating my own birthdays and hired a kind, pretty lady who sold flowers to attend my parent-teacher meetings. I grew up in that loneliness until I met Joseph. At school, he casually blocked a ball that was about to hit me on the basketball court. Under the sunlight, he looked particularly handsome, with a few beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. He tilted his head slightly, a hint of arrogance in his voice as he said, "Careful, classmate," that cool tone of voice. It only took one glance for me to fall for him. Back then I was too shy, muttered a quick thanks and ran away. After that, I began to pay attention to him, learning that he had a close childhood friend, but it seemed like their relationship was nothing more than that. My silent crush during those years was quiet, yet quietly grew in my heart. Later, even if we bumped into each other or exchanged a glance, it would make my heart race and my face flush. I knew that I probably wouldn't have much say in my future marriage. So when I found out that Joseph was my arranged marriage partner, I was happy for a long time. My parents were also fond of Joseph, keeping in touch with him more often than with me in the previous life. When I asked for a divorce from Joseph, my parents were completely against it. Joseph is capable and even puts up with your bad habits. You should be grateful instead of making us worry. I knew that ever since our marriage, the Lynn and Shin families' interests were tied together, and getting a divorce wasn't easy. So I endured year after year until I developed depression and began self-harming, forcing Joseph to agree to a divorce. Now that I have a second chance, I want to live for myself this time. That's why I don't want to go home. But suddenly, I remembered there was still something I needed to deal with, so I had to go back. Before leaving, I took Jonathan's phone from his pocket, entered my number, and called myself. Once I heard my phone ring, I handed his phone back to him. "Remember to save my number. I'll come find you in a few days." With that, I hailed a taxi and left. From beginning to end, I didn't give Joseph a single glance. Chapter 8. When I returned home, I found my parents sitting in the living room waiting for me. Before I could say anything, they began to scold me harshly. "Joseph told us what happened today. Can you stop being so reckless in the future? Those were kidnappers. Jessica, you could have been killed, and you told Joseph to save someone else first." Mom sighed heavily as she spoke. "How can we trust you with the company if you keep behaving like this?" They didn't trust me, so in the previous life, they handed the company over to Joseph. Then they could relax and start chasing the dreams of their youth. Dad, who had been sitting silently on the sofa, suddenly spoke up. "Let's just get the wedding done soon." "I don't agree." I spoke in a tone that left no room for negotiation. "I came back to tell you that tomorrow I'm going to the Shin family to call off this engagement. Whether you agree or not, this time I'm making the decision. And don't even think about threatening me with the company. You can give it to whoever you want. I don't want it anymore. In this new life, I already know the trends of the next 7 years. There's no way I'll end up destitute." After saying these words, I went back to my room. They must be even more disappointed in me now, right? I don't care anymore. The next day I got up early, but I was surprised to find Mom had made breakfast and was waiting for me. "Aunt Fong told me you got up looking for food last night. It's my fault. I forgot to ask if you had dinner." I froze, unable to understand why Mom had suddenly become so gentle and considerate. She affectionately tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear, then spoke in a remorseful tone. "Your father and I reflected last night. Maybe we've been using the wrong approach all this time. We wanted you to grow up to be independent, so we didn't spoil you, fearing it would make you arrogant. If you want to make your own decisions, that's fine. We're not going to force you to marry into the Shin family. Does this mean they're agreeing to let me break off the engagement? Suddenly, I felt a pang of sadness. Little Jessica used to argue and fight, but all she got was scolding. Later, she learned to be obedient and sensible, thinking it would earn their attention. But instead, they only saw her as weak and incapable. Now, all it took was for me to use their harsh tactics. And they finally changed their minds. It felt unbelievable, even as the car arrived at the Shin family villa. Chapter 9. Actually, the idea of the Lynn and Shin family alliance originally came from Joseph's grandmother. It all started when I saved Mrs. Shin at a banquet after she fainted from low blood sugar. After she regained consciousness, she was very grateful and insisted on making me her goddaughter. We got to know each other through that connection. I would often go to the Shin family's old house for meals. It wasn't until one day, when I met Joseph there, that I realized Mrs. Shin was his grandmother. Mrs. Shin was sharp and immediately noticed my feelings for Joseph. That's how everything unfolded later. Now, having to personally tell her that I wanted to cancel the engagement felt a bit wrong. After all, she had already given me the bracelet that had been passed down in the Shin family for generations. Now, it seemed I could only return it. Chapter 10. Joseph arrived before me, with Chloe by his side. They were both dressed rather formally. Perfect for after I break off the engagement, they can immediately get engaged. Everyone wins. But as I placed the bracelet on the table, Joseph grabbed my wrist and asked, "What's the meaning of this?" Right. Last night, I only told him to meet me at the Shin family's old house. I didn't mention the breakup. Mrs. Shin looked at the two of us, as if realizing something. "Jessica, did Joseph do something to hurt you?" As she spoke, she shot a fierce glare at Chloe. I respectfully addressed Mrs. Shen. "Grandma Shen, I'm the one who wants to break off the engagement with Joseph." My tone was calm, as if I were merely discussing today's weather. Joseph's pupils suddenly contracted upon hearing this. He was clearly in disbelief. "Why?" "Because yesterday you left me to save someone else. I think that's who you really want to marry, isn't it?" I looked at Chloe and found her staring back at me, putting on the stubborn look of a delicate little flower. "No." Joseph's voice wavered with self-doubt. "Wasn't it you who asked me to save Chloe first? I was testing you and the result was clear." Joseph was suddenly speechless. Mrs. Shin sighed and said, "I heard about what happened yesterday. You're a good child, and it's Joseph who isn't worthy of you." Joseph abruptly interrupted Mrs. Shen. He squeezed my wrist, so tightly I thought he might break my bones. "I won't agree to this. Don't even think about it." My wounds from yesterday hadn't healed. And now, with his grip, they were probably bleeding again. I endured the pain, suddenly finding it all very funny in the previous life after Chloe's death. He mourned her for 7 years. Now, having been reborn, he couldn't wait to save Chloe. I thought he was deeply in love with her, eager to marry her as soon as possible. I tugged at the corner of my mouth and laughed, "If you insist. Then, tomorrow I'll find the media and unilaterally announce the cancellation of our engagement. That way, it'll be Urshan family that's embarrassed." With that, I pried his fingers off one by one and turned to leave. Chapter 11. I didn't expect Joseph to chase after me. Just then, Jonathan's motorcycle arrived at the entrance of the Shin family home, not wanting to get entangled with Joseph any further. I simply said, "Sorry, my boyfriend's here to pick me up." Joseph frowned, displeased and mocked. "Jessica, are you sure you want to be with this poor guy? Do you think he can make you happy? Better than being with someone like you, hypocritical and two-faced." With that, I walked toward Jonathan, but in the next second, my wrist was grabbed again. Ouch! I let out a cry of pain. It was only then that Joseph noticed the injury on my wrist. Flustered, he tried to explain. I didn't know you were hurt." I lowered my eyes, my smile full of sarcasm, as if you'd care even if you did. Jonathan, seeing this, couldn't hold back anymore. He rushed forward and knocked Joseph to the ground with one quick, precise punch. Joseph spat out a mouthful of blood, his eyes filled with rage, but he didn't dare make another move. Jonathan, using a warning tone, said, "Stay away from her." He then placed his helmet on my head, revved the engine, and took me away. The motorcycle sped through the mountain roads, the scenery flashing by. I leaned against Jonathan's back, feeling the thrill of speed. It was as if this could temporarily erase all the unpleasantness from before. "Where does my girlfriend want to go?" Jonathan's voice came from in front of me. I chuckled. It seemed he had heard what I said earlier. So, naturally, I wrapped my arms around his waist and said, "Since you're calling me your girlfriend, can I check out your place? Besides, I'm hungry." "Of course. No problem. I happen to be a decent cook." "Then I want 4 dishes. Consider it done." Jonathan's laughter echoed through the mountains. Maybe it was his influence, but at this moment I felt incredibly carefree. Chapter 12. Jonathan's home was bigger than I expected. He hurriedly brought me a pair of brand new men's slippers. "They might be a bit big, but it's the only new pair I have." I slipped them on casually, smiling. "It's fine. Good thing I come back occasionally to tidy up. It shouldn't be too messy." Although he was the host, he seemed more nervous than I was. I plopped down on the sofa, resting my chin on my hand as I looked at him. "I can't cook, so you'll have to do the hard work today." Instead of heading to the kitchen right away, Jonathan brought over a first aid kit. The bandage from yesterday had stuck to my wound after Joseph squeezed it, and the blood had dried. Making it adhere to the bandage, Jonathan carefully poured iodine onto the bandage, trying to soften the wound and the cloth. Such a delicate task. Yet this big man handled it with the utmost care. Half an hour later, the wound was rebandaged. He didn't forget to remind me. "Don't get it wet for the next couple of days." I instinctively replied, "How am I supposed to take a bath then?" 2 days without a bath is fine." After thinking for a moment, he added, "I won't mind." "You wouldn't dare." "I wouldn't. Should I go make dinner now?" "Yes." I nodded with a smile. I suddenly realized that whenever I was with Jonathan, I always felt particularly relaxed. An hour later, he brought out 4 dishes: sweet and sour pork, garlic shrimp, steamed fish, and cucumber salad. He handed me the chopsticks. "Try it." I tasted each dish and gave him a thumbs up. The colors, aroma, and flavors were perfect, leaving a lasting impression. Just like him, looks like I won't have to worry about where to eat in the future. Chapter 13. In the afternoon, I received a call from my father. The gist of it was that he wanted me to attend the auction in 10 days, saying that if I could secure the land in South City, the company would be handed over to me entirely. I knew about that piece of land. Besides the Shun and Lynn families, several other companies were eyeing it in the previous life. I was shaken by the kidnapping incident, and Chloe's death afterward left me emotionally unsettled. I fell seriously ill and missed the auction, but even if I hadn't been sick, I wouldn't have competed against Joseph. Back then, I was completely devoted to him, thinking I had finally found someone I could trust for life. But the Shin family was facing a debt crisis at the time, and securing that land was still a challenge for Joseph in the end. I transferred some funds from Lynn's company to help him. Joseph eventually won the bid, and after acquiring the land, he built a theme park there. It attracted numerous businesses, and within a few years, he successfully elevated the Shin family to new heights. This clearly showed that the land was a lucrative investment, which is why so many people were after it. But this time, I'm determined to win it. I didn't expect Chloe to come begging me. Unlike her aggressive attitude a few days ago, she was now humbling herself, pleading with me in a meek voice. "Could you please not break off the engagement with Joseph? He and I have always been just friends. If you agree, I promise I'll never appear in front of you again." I silently looked at her, feeling nothing but speechlessness. Yes, in the previous life, I always believed they were just good friends. But after Chloe died, Joseph's actions made it clear that his feelings for her were far more than just mourning a friend. I remember the day he agreed to divorce me. It was after I had developed depression and had attempted self-harm for the 10th time. He came home to find me lying on the floor, covered in blood, perhaps afraid that I might die in his house. He finally agreed to the divorce, but on the way to finalize it, he suddenly asked me, "Do you know what today is?" "It's Chloe's death anniversary." I looked at him in confusion and shook my head. I could barely take care of myself. How could I remember that? But my reaction thoroughly enraged Joseph. He pounded the steering wheel in anger, calling me cold and heartless. "The life you're living now was bought with Chloe's sacrifice. But you've never been grateful. You've even forgotten her death anniversary. All you think about is leaving. Do you think you can escape your guilt that easily? Jessica, you disgust me." At that moment, I was so angry that I retorted, "Yes, you're grateful. You can't forget her. So why didn't you die with her?" As soon as I said that, the car swerved uncontrollably and finally plunged off a cliff. Even in his dying moments, Joseph was still blaming me. We owed Chloe this debt. We were supposed to atone for it in this life. So who are you to live in peace? But in this life, neither of us owes the other anything anymore. I'm curious to see what kind of ending Joseph will meet this time. Chapter 14. I gestured for Chloe to stop talking. After all, constantly recalling the past life really made me feel sick. Do you not understand the situation? The Shun and Lynn families have already tacitly agreed that the engagement is off. Did Joseph send you? She shook her head. No, I just don't want to see him lose. Jessica, didn't you always like Joseph? This is all my fault. I shouldn't have suspected you of hiring the kidnappers, and I shouldn't have suddenly come back from abroad. If I hadn't, Joseph wouldn't have hurt you by saving me. Her words were making my head spin. You don't want to see him lose? Chloe explained. The Shin family needs that land in South City to turn things around. Jessica, if you insist on breaking off the engagement, can you at least not compete with Joseph for the land? I let out a cold laugh. Are you dreaming? Finally, I understood. In the previous life, when we rushed to save Chloe, the police had already captured the kidnappers, and the 2 large ransom payments were successfully recovered. Along with the money I took from the Lynn family, Joseph was able to secure the land. But now, because I saved myself and alerted the kidnappers, they've likely fled to who knows where. The police haven't found any solid leads, let alone recovered the ransom. So, it looks like the Shin family has lost their advantage in securing the land. Chloe, however, still wouldn't give up. She bit her lip and suddenly knelt down in front of me. Jessica, I'm begging you. You may not love him, but can't you at least not ruin him? I've seen emotional blackmail before, but never something this shameless. I bent down, leaned in close to her, and whispered, when you heard Joseph was going to marry me. You went abroad, but when you heard we were engaged, you suddenly came back. You're right. This is all your fault. So, you should be the one helping him. Your Tan family may not be as wealthy as my Lin family, but you can help a little, right? And besides, the last time he took money, it was to save you. It had nothing to do with me. So why are you begging me? Should I call you foolish, or call myself foolish? Hearing this, Chloe's face turned pale. She opened her mouth, but in the end didn't say anything else. If she could figure things out, good. If not, the only one who'd suffer would be her. Chapter 15. During this time, I went home and found that my parents had left again. It seems they're still the same, only caring about their own pursuits, never changing. All they need is a qualified heir. They don't care who it is. Whatever. It's not like I really care about them anyway. I stayed home for 2 days, and my wrist had mostly healed. I took a car from the garage and headed straight to Jonathan's repair shop. But before I could find Jonathan, I ran into that big guy with the floral tattoo from before. He awkwardly greeted me. Hello, sis. Where's Jonathan? I asked him. He scratched his head and replied, Brother Ming went out. Are you looking for him for something? As soon as he finished speaking, he smacked himself on the mouth, mumbling, Why can't I get anything right? Can't she just visit for no reason? Then he grinned at me and said, Sis, why don't you take a seat? Brother Ming should be back soon. I nodded and sat down on the sofa. There were several different tea sets on the coffee table. I made myself a pot of tea and slowly savored it. The big guy didn't leave. Instead, he watched me with a look of curiosity, sneaking glances at me from time to time, seeing me making tea by myself. He explained, I'm a rough guy. I don't know how to make this stuff. Usually, Brother Ming makes it for me. I hope you don't mind. I looked up and asked, What's your name? Daniel, is he good to you? I'm not sure why, but I had that feeling. Daniel shook his head, and I thought I was wrong, but then he said, No, Brother Ming is good to all of us. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, tell me about it. Most of the people who work at this repair shop come from impoverished areas, and many of them have some physical challenges. For example, Ryu, who works on the engines, can't speak, but he can tell what's wrong just by listening to the sounds. Then there's Juan, who does maintenance. He has a limp, and Ken, who handles painting, can't read a single word. When they first came to the city, They were just looking for a way to make a living. But when they got here, they realized that with physical disabilities, no education, and no skills, it was hard even to find a decent job. Brother Ming took them in, gave them time to learn the trade, provided food and shelter, and even paid them. So this group of people became loyal to Brother Ming, following him wherever he went. I see. I looked at Daniel again and asked, "What about you?" Hearing this, his face suddenly turned serious for the first time. I met Brother Ming 5 years ago. At that time, I had crossed the wrong people and was nearly beaten to death. It was Brother Ming who saved me. Since then, I've sworn to follow Brother Ming for life. If anyone dares to mess with him, they'll have to step over my dead body first. To be honest, after hearing this, I was deeply moved. All my life, I've been surrounded by loneliness, with few people truly caring for me. But Jonathan was able to gather such a group of people who would follow him so faithfully. I felt a sudden surge of envy and a strong desire to see him. "Do you know where he went?" Daniel thought for a moment and said, "Brother Ming didn't say exactly, just that someone was looking for him, somewhere near Tianjin Plaza." I was about to leave when Daniel seemed to remember something and added, "Oh, by the way, sis, Brother Ming is actually quite wealthy. He's just very low-key about it. He originally told us not to call you sis. He said, since you're from a wealthy family, we should call you miss." I frowned at that. Why is Jonathan still using such old-fashioned titles? Chapter 16. I never would have imagined that I'd walk into a cafe at Tianjin Plaza and see Jonathan sitting with Chloe. I didn't know what Chloe was saying to Jonathan, but her eyes were red as if she'd been crying. And Jonathan was just listening, his brows furrowed the whole time. After watching for a while, I saw Chloe suddenly stand up and move from her seat to sit next to Jonathan. My intuition told me something wasn't right between them. If it were the old me from before today, I might have just left, then blocked Jonathan. After being hurt once, I absolutely cannot tolerate any relationship that isn't pure. But if it's Jonathan, I want to trust him this time. Just as I was about to walk into the cafe, I saw Jonathan quickly get up from his seat, as if he was trying to avoid something dirty. And then, as he left, we locked eyes. Compared to my calmness, Jonathan was taken aback for a moment, clearly not expecting to see me there, and then quickly walked over to me. "Jessica." Chloe also came out at this moment, her face showing a hint of urgency. "Mr. Ming, if you can just agree." Chloe's next words stopped abruptly when she saw me, but she quickly composed herself and instead asked me, "Jessica, what are you doing here? Are you here to see Mr. Ming too?" she said, intentionally leaning closer to Jonathan. But Jonathan was quick, and as she moved closer, he immediately jumped to my side, looking at me with a slightly guilty expression. He said, "Jessica, I pretended to be stern. We'll talk about this later." Chloe watched our interaction, her eyes growing dim. "Jessica, I really underestimated you." I shrugged and replied, "Yeah, I think so too." Chloe was at a loss for words. Her face was as if a paint palette had been overturned, turning all sorts of colors, from green to white to red, a rather amusing sight. In truth, I'm not the type to easily suffer a loss in the previous life. If I hadn't taken people who didn't care about me so seriously, I wouldn't have ended up in such a miserable state. Chapter 17. Jonathan brought me back home. By then, the sky had already turned dark. We nestled on the sofa, neither of us saying a word. After a long silence, he was the first to speak. "Aren't you going to ask? Didn't you say you'd come back to deal with me?" I replied softly, "If you want to talk, you'll tell me even if I don't ask. If you don't want to, asking won't make a difference." Jonathan's expression remained neutral. "Do you know why Chloe came to see me?" I shook my head on the way back. I had thought of many reasons. For instance, maybe Chloe had taken an interest in Jonathan, or maybe Joseph couldn't stand seeing us happy and deliberately sent Chloe to irritate me. After all, they were close and would do anything for each other. But then Jonathan suddenly asked if I was eyeing that piece of land in South City. I was shocked. "How do you know?" "Because that land's usage rights are currently in my hands. It's something my father left for me." How could it be such a coincidence? Wait. So Chloe, not giving up, decided to go directly to Jonathan to try to get to him through that. But how did she know the land belonged to Jonathan? There was only one answer, Joseph told her, in the previous life. When Joseph acquired the land, he must have interacted with Jonathan. So he knew. Seeing Jonathan staring at me, I quickly realized something. You don't think I approached you for that land, do you? Suddenly a wave of discomfort washed over me. So while I had my doubts about him, he had been suspicious of me too. I lowered my head, wanting to laugh, but I couldn't seeing this. Jonathan suddenly cupped my face and said seriously, "Fool, of course I don't think that way." At first, the thought did flash through my mind, but I quickly dismissed it. "I trust my judgment," I asked, "just like when you saved Daniel and the others?" Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "No, you're different from them. I saved them out of kindness. I saved you because I was moved. Jonathan, you're really good at flirting." I pouted, complaining slightly. He must have had lots of practice. Jonathan looked at me indulgently, his hands on my face gently tilting my head up. Then he kissed me, just a light touch like a dragonfly skimming the water. It's not about being good at flirting. It's sincere, natural, and instinctive. I felt my cheeks heat up, my heart racing uncontrollably, afraid he'd notice how flustered I was. I buried my face in his chest. My ear was pressed against his chest, and the sound of his heartbeat was like thunder, loud and strong, as if it was proclaiming his love for me. I closed my eyes, savoring the moment, and after a long while I said, "Jonathan, I like you just as much as you like me." He didn't respond with words. Instead, he showed me through his actions. He hugged me even tighter, as if he wanted to meld me into his very being. Chapter 18. The next morning, when I woke up, Jonathan handed me a document. When I took it and looked at it, I saw that it was a land use rights transfer agreement with my name filled in as the recipient. "Jonathan, are you crazy? Do you know what this means?" I couldn't believe it. How could someone be so foolish? "I've already withdrawn from the auction. You want that land, and I just happen to have it, so there's no reason not to give it to you." I couldn't deny that I was deeply moved. My heart felt like it was full to bursting, warm and swelling with emotion. I blinked away the tears that threatened to spill over. This was a good thing. No reason to cry. Since he was showing such sincerity, I couldn't be outdone. I grabbed his hand and started walking. "Before you sign, come with me somewhere first." The place I took him was the Civil Affairs Bureau. Jonathan asked me repeatedly, "Are you sure about this?" I smiled at him. "Aren't you afraid I'll take your land? Then ditch you and find someone richer and better looking?" Jonathan frowned, thinking for a moment. "Well, I can't speak for richer, but it would be hard to find someone better looking." Yes, exactly. That's why I'm dragging you here." Chapter 19. I didn't expect Joseph to find us so quickly. Jonathan and I had just stepped out of the Civil Affairs Bureau, and we hadn't even had time to put away our marriage certificates. Joseph's face darkened to the extreme when he saw us, and his clenched fists were trembling. He spoke. "Jessica, you've really chosen him after all." "Crazy." I rolled my eyes, not intending to engage with him, but Joseph grabbed my arm and suddenly tears started streaming down his face. Were those crocodile tears? But there were some things I wanted to say to Joseph, so I told Jonathan to wait for me in the car. Once it was just the two of us. Joseph immediately started speaking. "Jessica, I regret it. I really regret it. You can hit me, yell at me, whatever you want. Just please forgive me." I sneered and asked, "Regret? What exactly do you regret? Not saving me, or not treating me well in our past life?" Joseph's grip on my wrist loosened, and the color drained from his face in an instant. It seemed even he didn't want to recall the events of our past life. After all, those memories clearly revealed his many wrongdoings. At that moment, Joseph began to slap himself, muttering as he did, "I was blinded. I was wrong. I deserve to die. But Jessica, is there still a chance for us?" I paused for a moment, then asked him calmly, "Joseph, what do you think?" He stopped and lowered his gaze, looking defeated. Then, as if a thought struck him, a glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes. "No, it's Chloe. It's all her fault. If she hadn't suddenly come back, none of this would have happened, and I never asked her to come find you. It was all her doing, all one-sided." He grabbed my hand again, pleading desperately. "Please, just trust me one last time, okay? The person I've always loved is you. Truly, I know I've sinned, so I won't ask for anything else. Just that you look at me, even if you let me be third place. That's fine." I stared at Joseph in shock, unable to believe these words were coming out of his mouth. I yanked my hand back forcefully, even wiping it on my clothes. "Joseph, what are you after?" Of course, I didn't believe he truly loved me. Once you experience true love, this feels like nothing but worthless garbage. Joseph, with a look of deep emotion, said, "I realized it too late, but I won't give up on you." I felt a chill run down my spine, as if I were being haunted by a ghost. "Joseph, if you keep this up, I'm going to call the police." Joseph froze in place, tears flowing uncontrollably. I just felt irritated, desperate to leave. "Joseph, the only person you've ever loved is yourself. Whether it's Chloe or me, nothing matters to you as much as your own interests. But you're not satisfied, are you? Why can I leave you and still have a better life? So now you want to drag me back into the abyss. But Joseph, I'm not alone anymore. My husband now is tough and ruthless, and he's got a group of people willing to fight for him. If you're feeling brave, go ahead and try." After saying that, I glanced over at Chloe, who was standing not far away. I had noticed her following us for a while, but hadn't said anything. I hope she can finally see Joseph for who he really is and stop being someone who's taken advantage of and doesn't even realize it. Chapter 20. It felt like a farce had finally come to an end. After learning that I had successfully secured the land, my father, true to his word, handed the company over to me. I didn't tell them about getting married to Jonathan because I didn't want anyone interfering with our lives. I just wanted a peaceful life for the two of us. Each day passed quietly. With my time split between the company and home, not long after, I heard that Chloe was leaving the country. Even the person who loved Joseph the most didn't want him anymore. Before she left, she posted a long article on social media condemning Joseph for his betrayal, cold-heartedness, and lack of integrity. With nothing better to do, I decided to give that article a bit of a boost. As a result, the Shin family, already in a debt crisis, saw their stocks plummet further, and they were reportedly on the brink of bankruptcy. Joseph was running around frantically every day, desperately seeking help. But at that point, who would be willing to help him? So once again, he came to me. It had been several months since we last saw each other. Now I was busy every day with the development of that land, motivated by the prospect of future wealth. But the Joseph standing before me now was a shadow of the man I'd seen months ago. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and bruised, his beard unkempt, and his entire demeanor reeked of defeat. I asked him, "Are you here to ask for my help?" To my surprise, he shook his head. He told me, "Jessica, I've been diagnosed with depression. I haven't had a good night's sleep in months. I finally understand the pain you went through before. This is my punishment." I fought back a smile and said, "How can this be punishment? It's a blessing. Think about it. In your last life, you died regretting that you couldn't save Chloe, even with all your success and having me by your side. You were never truly happy, but now heaven has given you a second chance. Even though you've lost everything, you've made up for the regret of your past life. That's enough. Heaven has been kind to you. People can't be too greedy. You gain some. You lose some. You can't have it all." That was the last time I saw Joseph, because 3 months later, on the night Shin Corporation declared bankruptcy, Joseph got drunk, had a depressive episode, and drowned in his bathtub. By the time someone found him, he was already cold. Indeed, what goes around comes around. Chapter 21. When Jonathan heard about it, he was giving me a back massage. My dad used to tell me, if someone's character is flawed, they're destined not to go far. I turned over and couldn't help but ask, "Then how far do you think we'll go?" Jonathan thought seriously and said with our character, "I'd say 100 years wouldn't be too much to ask for." I wholeheartedly agreed. Of course it wouldn't be. Then it wouldn't be too much for your husband to ask for a good meal, right? Jonathan looked at me with intense eyes, his gaze reflecting me as if I were the most beautiful rose in the world. They say loving someone is like tending to a flower. Jonathan cherished me, never letting me suffer even the slightest hardship. And as a result, I became stronger and more fulfilled, the things I never had in 2 lifetimes. Jonathan gave me an abundance. I wrapped my arms around his neck, kissed his lips, and said, "Not too much at all."